Hey everyone, in my ever-present quest to review the Avengers line of comics throughout their history, we now turn to an interesting chapter in their series, where they were written by John Byrne, until they very suddenly weren't. Before we get into all of that, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more recaps and reviews of comics, new and old. The year was the late 1980s. Back then, in the folly of my youth, rather than reading Avengers comics, I was busy gestating in my mother's womb, though eventually I did grow out of that phase. Twice in a row now, in spite of some decent quality comics coming out of the series, Marvel editorial saw Avengers writers leave, and doing so under rocky circumstances, to put it politely. It does appear that the general climate in the company made things difficult to find a writer willing to stick around for the series, and fully explore a new take on the theme. Because even for the next few years after this, the series would continue to shift from one writer to the next. This appears to have initially happened because Marvel very clearly wanted the Avengers to look and feel different from the more light and lax tones set in the 80s. However, those dynamics did indeed change with the arrival of John Byrne, a legendary but complicated comic book artist who was chosen to helm Marvel's biggest team of superheroes as the new writer. The choice is interesting for a few reasons. One, if Marvel was looking for somebody to bring stability and a calming presence to the behind-the-scenes drama going on with the Avengers, they chose one of the worst people for that. Even John Byrne himself has admitted his behavior can be extremely abrasive, and he can be hard to work with. Though some have defended him, major comic book figures and former Avenger contributors Roy Thomas and Jack Kirby have had very legitimate professional issues with the man, while other professional figures have made it very clear they will never work with the dude again. This year alone in 2020 has found this particular issue resurface. Collectively, there's a lot of invisible baggage hanging around this particular review. Now, in general, when it comes to matters like this, I don't usually let the drama affect my review of the actual material at hand, unless the drama already did that. If Byrne is a terrible dude, but you wouldn't know it from his Avengers comics, well then we're probably going to give this era a high grade, regardless of what Byrne might have done outside of writing this series. After all, this is a group project. A lot of people other than Byrne worked on these Avengers books. On the other hand, if the drama somehow did affect the actual Avengers comics, well then suddenly it might make sense why I've been talking about John Byrne like this for so long now. Because that is going to affect my overall opinion and final grade quite a bit. It would have to. So far in grading the Avengers, we reviewed plenty of books that lean in both directions in the Avengers series at one point or another. So let's look at the Avengers comics Byrne wrote, independent of any preconceived notions I might have of the man. Because the choice to pick him as a writer is interesting in and of itself. For one thing, it gets into the fact that we are rapidly transitioning into the 90s with this era, where artists would increasingly take prominence. John Byrne is, after all, primarily known as an artist. He had penciled a number of Avengers comics long before he was ever chosen to write the series. And as we march closer into the 1990s, it makes sense that artists like him were starting to see new opportunities to write books like the Avengers. For those of you that don't know, this is the decade I would say out of all of comic history that most emphasized artists and increasingly had comics shifting towards them taking control over the storytelling. And while it's an excellent thing that comic book artists increasingly took credit for the creation of these comic books over time, I've found historically comic book artists taking on writing duties tend to be very inconsistent. I always think of that 10,000 hours needed to master something thing. Artists have spent that 10,000 hours doing so, but rarely have they also spent 10,000 hours writing, and usually wouldn't have seen these opportunities unless they had already been drawing comic books and had a foot in the door. If they were just going by their writing talent, I struggle to imagine most artists turned writers would ever have been hired as comic book writers. It goes the other way around too, but there are plenty of exceptions to that rule, and broadly speaking, John Byrne's time with the Avengers is a pretty strong example of where this stuff can work out well. He was paired with a penciler named Paul Ryan, not that one, and Tom Palmer, inking for the majority of his run on the Avengers book, while Byrne largely drew the West Coast series himself. And it does seem like through his past work and perspective as an artist, Byrne was able to bring out the best in the team from a visual point of view. His era starts out with one of my favorite spreads in the entire history of this series. Captain America summons just about every character to have ever called themselves an Avenger at this point. and announces that the team will be taking on a new dynamic to it. Both the main and West Coast team would be now headquartered in the Hydro base, allowing for more fluidity between the two teams. After all, Byrne was also doing the West Coast and even handling the art duties of that series at the time. But even though both teams would be kind of whittled down to a core membership, everyone present at this initial meeting would be welcome and potentially called upon for future missions. I assumed as the Avengers would be whittled down to a core 6 with a 7th spot left open for guests, that would be pretty much it for this awesome group shot we get at the beginning of this run. But no. In a move that really emphasizes Byrne's identity as an artist, just about every character shown in this group ends up doing something or another at some point in what wound up being a pretty short run with John Byrne. It's a very impressive use of not wasting visual space and instead using the artwork to orient your audience towards future content. Byrne knocks this kind of technical stuff out of the park. In general, this page is a pretty strong hint of what the first half of the run feels like. Not just in terms of what characters we're going to see, but just in terms of the big energy it has. In a story as simple as the Avengers battling lava men, the Hydro base gets launched into the sky in a staggering moment, and the rest of the adventure is filled with similar visually striking shenanigans. I was so impressed by the first arc that I was set to give this era an A. It felt exciting and full of classic adventures. The creativity was on a level I hadn't seen since the Jack Kirby days. And we were even getting some attention directed towards the Eternals, such as Gilgamesh remaining a core part of the team, while another Eternal named Cersei also joined and would stay with the Avengers for the majority of the 90s.
Looking over the next decade, it seems Byrne was very influential in which characters were used, and the general tone that these comics would take in the years to come.
It took them 3 whole writers, but Marvel's editorial team had finally found and achieved the change in the Avengers they were apparently seeking around this time, and so desperately craved. Then the Avengers had their big tie-in event, again part of a larger ongoing trend for more and more crossover tie-ins. As I said in the Roger Stern days, the tie-ins can be fun, but in John Byrne's time, Acts of Vengeance is an example of where things can largely hold an era back. The story itself is okay in that it's a bit of a classic fun kind of superhero adventure where all the villains in the Marvel Universe hatch a big plan to fight superheroes they don't normally battle. It certainly has its moments, but it's just adequate and ultimately derails Byrne's run and kills the momentum he had going at a pretty key moment when he was just establishing his own Avengers story. I don't know if that's what informed what happened next, but I have a feeling the tie-in might have put Byrne off to a degree. Regardless of what actually happened, halfway through the next story arc, Byrne left the series entirely, flat out abandoning it mid-story. It was a move that in Avengers history is and largely remains unprecedented. Most other writers, even the ones dismissed, managed to transition out a lot more gently, because this story had the terrible effect on the overall quality of the story itself, but also my opinion of Byrne's time with the Avengers. Remember that Byrne's time with the series is relatively short, so this takes up a good chunk of it on the whole. Worse than that, it did irreparable damage to the era that would follow, weakening the overall efforts of the poor writer who had to replace John Byrne and try and figure out this story with what looks like very little information or help from Byrne himself. It wound up being a muddled mess involving the Avengers teaming up with Spider-Man, all on an adventure with Nebula somewhere in the depths of space. Sounds cool, but it's just so bafflingly bad. And so, as far as Byrne's run is concerned, what starts as one of the most promising runs in Avengers history, after only 13 issues, ends with one of the worst Avengers stories I've ever read. A B grade might seem generous for a relatively short run that obviously I feel kind of fell apart near the end. But John Byrne's era is an era of extremes. It had so many cool moments to it and is one of the best looking eras in all of Avengers history. But it is a relatively short run that didn't really go anywhere, badly damaged the final story arc and the Avengers comics to come after Byrne left the series, and also kind of walked back some of the more progressive moves as Byrne basically left Stern's team behind completely. But overall, the first half or so of John Byrne's time as writer for the series does a lot to make up for all of it too. I just really admire how much that first half is full of creativity and life. and certainly would recommend you check out at least that part for yourself. In spite of some mistakes made in the final moments of this era, Byrne, just like his predecessor, presented a clear vision of the Avengers that was bigger than ever, but also just that same sort of delightful, adventurous fun that made the series great to begin with. However, just like Walt Simonson before him, the B grade also to a degree reflects that these are both short runs that had a lot of potential, but that potential was never really realized on page in any of these books. But it should be noted that a B is a little different than a B- like Walt Simonson got. Remembering that this grade is only relative to Avengers comics themselves, and that I spread these grades out on purpose so we wouldn't get 10 different eras with straight A's, it's worth pointing out that though this series is on the lower end of it, out of the 22 eras of Avengers comics we'll be looking at, John Byrne's Avengers makes it into the top 10 overall. It falls apart very quickly and basically turns into a mess, but those early days and the energy behind them is some of the best Avengers content I've ever seen. So yes, it's a very mixed era with a lot of pros and cons kind of going into the extremes, which kind of left it in the middle with a B grade. But it does stand out in Avengers history. I do think any Avengers fan would want to read at least some of this run. And with that, one unlucky writer was forced to start writing for a series halfway through another person's arc, with, as far as I can tell, little to no support or direction from John Byrne. It would be a difficult task for anyone, but Marvel tapped a major writer perhaps best known for co-creating Deadpool, Fabian Nicieza. We'll talk about his time on the series next on Grading the Avengers.